Jon Clarke on the channel. Now, he's written a book about Christian Bruckner, and oh my goodness, I was sick to my stomach reading about the monsters lurking in that part of Portugal. You would have never took a child on holiday there in your life if you knew about the behavior of some of the people out there, and specifically Christian. I mean, he was the kind of guy, he didn't discriminate, whether it was snatching a kid from a park or a granny would wake up in the middle of the night and he'd be there with a gimp mask on in the corner of a room saying her name, and before he did horrific things. But fantastic writing, John, real eye-opener. I mean, whether people believe he was involved with Maddie or not, just the depth of research he did as to the monsters lurking in that area of Portugal at that time absolutely terrified me, and I was completely gripped. But the link for the book and the link for John's website are all in the description box, folks. And before we get into all this, like I said, I was up till midnight watching the Channel 4 documentary last night. But before we go over all that, could you just briefly tell the viewers, there's probably some new viewers who are not familiar with your work, John, a little bit about you and what got you on this mission, please?
Yeah, good morning, Shaun. I know this is your earliest podcast, apparently, according to one of your comments, one of your viewers' comments. I'm sorry about that. I was up like you last night. You probably were watching Channel 4 Plus One like I was, because I wanted to see the end of the Arsenal game, which was quite interesting. And so it was a late night, and it was interesting to see Channel 4 on the Sun and Rob Patterson doing a good job there, backing up pretty much what 3/4, or no, I should say 99% of the world thinks, which is that this man is very dangerous indeed, and probably in all probability is behind the snatch of Madeleine McCann, and in fact the murder of Madeleine McCann. So it was a late night, and I just to introduce myself, Shaun. I know we've spoken before, but I'm a bit like, one of those sort of rare breeds of journalists that still exist, that I would describe myself as a kind of investigative journalist, although I'm an editor and a publisher. So I spend a lot of my time having to organize other people and spend far too much time trying to run my business, which is increasingly difficult in the age of Meta and Google and these big companies that make it very difficult to do our jobs. But when I do get the opportunity, I love investigating things, and the Olive Press has been now 20 years in Spain, and we've done lots of investigation into lots of different things, whether it's, politicians or corruption or frauds or, sex offenders. And one of the cases that I got thrown into, not actually due to the Olive Press, but due to my previous work at the Daily Mail, was I was asked to go and investigate a little child going missing in 2007 May. It's actually almost exactly 18 years ago that I was called early in the morning. You were probably called early in the morning by your baby. I was called at, I think it was around 6-ish in the morning or 6:30 by the Mail foreign desk. I've said it so many times I can't really remember the exact time, but the bottom line is that I was called very early and got on the road quickly and got all the way down to Portugal, and then got dragged into what is effectively the world's largest missing persons case. So yeah, that was it for me, and I've been writing about it and talking about it, and anyone who wants to listen for the last 18 years. So that's me, really.
So there were so many different theories and suspects from the get-go. How did you manage to research and filter and get through all of that?
I think it's a very good question. And I think for people who are interested in the case, and there's many, many millions of them all around the world, there are so many characters involved. And I think what people didn't realize, but if you just look at what the Portuguese public themselves thought back in 2010, that Portugal was a paradise for paedophiles and sex offenders. And you then trace that back through the years, through the kind of famous Casa Pia case, where these orphanages were pretty much set up just to allow very senior paedophiles around the world to come to Portugal and enjoy their holidays, and often with, unfortunately, with child abuse as part of that. And Portuguese themselves, they voted the highest percentage in all of Europe that they felt that it was a problem, that their country was too lax. Now, you know, you only got to go back a couple of years earlier and see what happened in Pradeluge. We've seen the supposed list of 600 paedophiles on the sex offenders list, unofficial sex offenders list, one of whom they claim was Christian Bruckner, but I very much doubt that. I certainly doubt they even tracked him down or located him or tried to locate him. He was actually in prison. Not them, but when they tried to find him, he was in prison and they couldn't find him. It was very they were the Keystone Cops, as we now know, and in fact, thankfully, it was the German police and Scotland Yard who've managed to piece the case together as well as they have so far. It's a bit open to debate about whether they'll actually get across the finishing line, but that's a debate perhaps we should have.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that we look at his history because, you know, it really shows what he's capable of. Also, John, we use a code word now for that type of people. We call them PDFs because if we use the other word too much, YouTube suppresses the video. So we're gonna call these people PDFs if that's okay with you. And I know it's
so frustrating. Every day we put a story out. Every day Google it suspends our stories, and I have to appeal it every day. The next day they come back and they accept it. And we had one. This is a ridiculous example of this. We had the Michelin Man at an event in Malaga because they're having the Michelin Awards, this annual Michelin Awards in Spain. In Malaga. And so in the picture, you've got all these politicians, 2 or 3 very famous chefs. And in the front, you've got this big fat Michelin Man. And they blocked it for gross content, for unfair, you know, for fattest content or whatever. You know, you're absolutely right. So PDFs, I'll try and remember that. Yeah. That's the latest. Right. We have the same problem. We can't say sex offender in a headline. We can't say rapist. If we accuse someone of rape, it gets cancelled, the story, by Google, and we have to appeal it. And it's
we say instead of that now we say it's the same on YouTube. We say the R word now. He's done the R word to her, or he's R worded her, something like that. Yeah,
it must be difficult. Because in a crime podcast, it must be very hard.
It is, but we've learned over the years just to adapt to it, and all the viewers are hip to all these words as well now. So we actually have a code word sheet, but it's terrible that you can't talk frankly about these monsters to shine a light on them properly, and it's kind of insulting to survivors that we've got this algorithmic strangulation forcing us into this corner. But let's go back to Christian B then. So, you know, what was his upbringing like?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you absolutely say, and I have been cautious about using the word monster, for example, but the Sun have always very famously called him a monster. And as we've seen last night, and as we saw from the recent trial where admittedly they threw the cases out, although it's on appeal, he basically wrote a series of very gross stories about fantasies that he had as an adult, one of which was read in the court as a mother-daughter fantasy of snatching, kidnapping, using ether, to knock the victims out and then to take them to his paradise where he would get away with horrible things. Now, I going back to his upbringing, he obviously had a very tough upbringing. He was adopted. His first name was Fisher, and he was adopted by a couple along with 2 other boys, and he was treated very badly. There's no doubt about that. You know, he was locked in the cellar. He was beaten. He was sexually abused. He had a very difficult upbringing. There's no doubt about that. Nonetheless, it doesn't excuse the fact that from the age of 14, 15, 16, he was sexually assaulting children. The age of 17, he was in court. And on one occasion, there were 2 young children that he snatched. One girl he dragged into a bush, and another child who he actually followed into the garage of his own house to abuse. And one of these sexual assaults took place exactly 1 week before his trial. So knowing he was going to trial for 2 cases, he went and did it again, 3rd time. So this is a guy who knows no bounds, who's fearless, has always thought he can get away with it. Now, he did get a slap on the wrist that first time, but he didn't get very long inside. And although the German police clearly wanted to keep tabs on him, he was able to get out to do this mechanics course while he was serving his sentence. And before he'd actually served his sentence, he upped and left and went down to Portugal. This is one of the things that they didn't get correct last night. He arrived in Portugal in '99 in Pradeluge and settled there around the area with a girlfriend actually at the time. And it seemed, he seemed to all intents and purposes, people who knew him then, who I've spoken to, and some were in the book. And by the way, we are republishing the book. I should point that out. I've got a publisher in London who's republishing the book with a new intro, and I know there will be in a year's time, probably when the trial ever happens, there'll be a much more in-depth book. But he clearly had, right from the start, criminal tendencies, and it just went from there. And I think the police catalogue 17 convictions. He's currently in prison for rape from R. Sorry, I think it's really important that people know the background to this guy, and if he does ever get out, and supposedly, I don't know if you read the Mirror this morning, but I published an exclusive story along with the Olive Press about how there are some more court cases that they're throwing at him coming up next week. In fact, one for assaulting police officers. And so they are going to be putting as much spokes in the way to prevent him getting out September the 18th. He will at least serve at least another 6 months to a year, I'm told. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, extremely brazen and dangerous, as we saw, with the kid in the park. So it seems to me there was a pattern of leniency towards him and his ability to just evade justice by going to different jurisdictions. Do you think they should have been more severe on him from the get-go?
I think it's really difficult in a federal Germany because they've got, I think it's 15 or 16 different regions, and they're very standalone regions, and they all have their separate police forces. And he cleverly worked out that he could just move between these different regions, and it was very hard, therefore, for them to monitor what he was up to. And to make things even more complicated, and this was explained to me by the prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters, every time he moved to a new province or federal province, he went to Spain or Portugal in between. So he'd go to Portugal for a year or two, and then he'd go back to Germany, but a different region. So to keep tabs on him was extremely difficult. Then you've got to remember that he also spent time in certainly Eastern Europe, certainly bits in times in Italy, time in Austria, some time in Holland, moved around. He was a drifter. So you never really knew. It's very hard to keep tabs on him. Very hard, especially with Schengen, where you can move around Europe freely, and they're not monitoring borders anymore. So he was a difficult person to keep tabs on, and I think it's fair to say the Portuguese police, quite frankly, didn't give a stuff. And I think it's the slow realization is coming that they may have to face the truth that they allowed a very dangerous sex offender and potentially, shall I say, serial K. I don't know if you're allowed to say that or whatever, but could have been someone who killed a number of people in their borders and didn't monitor him properly. So I do think it would be, they should have monitored him more closely if they could, but it was very difficult.
So was it the lack of enthusiasm for the police force to go after these people that caused PDFs to gravitate towards Portugal during that era?
Yeah, I think it was seen as the perfect place to go, where the police really weren't interested in that as a crime. I mean, I think in my book, I wrote that in 2008, after Maddie went missing, you could be sitting in a cafe in a village somewhere in Portugal with your laptop open, watching child's pee, and you couldn't be caught for that, watching it, and so it was very lax. And of course, Spain, which had been the Wild West when we arrived here in sort of early 2000s, had been pretty wild, and a lot of stuff. The police really started cracking down in Spain, and of course, a lot of these kind of travelers and people who are up to no good moved across the border to Portugal, because there the police force was worse paid than Spain. They had less policemen. It was just as rugged and hidden. And he was able to sort of, these sort of new age traveler societies, these kind of van lifer types. He was able to drift in and out of these communities, basically selling drugs and doing odd jobs. There were times when he would settle down a bit with a girlfriend, and we now know he rented this house for, let's have a look, for 7 years. He lived just outside Pradaluz in this little house and of course he desperately didn't want anyone to find it. So when he was arrested, he gave different addresses, said he was living in his van. But he could blend into the community there and find like-minded people who wanted to do the same things as he wanted to do, which was, PDFs.
How was he able to sustain himself, and how did he purchase the creepy structure, the property that they showed us, where the swimming costumes are found of the kids?
Well, that's interesting. That was we saw that last night, and that's something new that came out. I mean, I don't know what your take was on the documentary. I felt like the narrative was generally good. It tried to explain as best as possible why the police think this guy's guilty. I can tell you now, there's a lot more that didn't go in that documentary. Stuff that they did know, but they couldn't put in, and stuff that they didn't know. But I think what's particularly interesting was some of the photographic and video evidence that we saw from the box factory that he owned in New Vigersleben, which was the converted box factory in East Germany. He bought in 2008 for 22,000, I think it was. And he wanted to sort of turn that into a kind of sculpture garden, creative art project, or whatever it was. But that's where he effectively stored, I think at one point, nearly 20 vehicles, which the police, by the way, took lots of them, a lot more than people realize, off the land, and obviously scoured for DNA and whatnot. But in the photos we saw last night for the first time, we saw the burial site where he buried his dog, Charlie. And underneath the body of Charlie was this plastic Aldi bag, Lidl bag, full of stuff that he'd hidden. And I think we saw for the first time a photograph of the 6 USB sticks and 2 memory sticks were on there. There were lots of photos and stuff that he shared, and his fantasies, and even an autobiography that he was writing. And of course, you also saw the 75 children's swimming costumes. A lot of them were in his Winnebago. You also saw the children's bikes, little toys. I mean, I've been around that place 3 times now, and there's still lots of evidence of bits and bobs they hadn't taken. And I do believe there's, that's some of it there. I do believe there's a lot more stuff there that they possibly didn't find. I'm told they did find it, because not only did they spend 3 days there initially, the 2016, they went back again. The BK Bundeskriminalamt in Wiesbaden, who were running the investigation, they went back and had a very, very good look at it again. Obviously, they told me they properly scoured all the tunnels underground, and this was somewhere that Bruckner loved. It was his fantasy, these underground tunnels, this sort of former, what I believe could have been some sort of concentration camp. And I think that, he loved the fact that he could store all his cars there. And I'm pretty sure that some pretty nasty things happened there. People who went there, visited, said that it had a very sinister atmosphere when he was there. And it's clearly, the money he got from that, interestingly, came from a robbery, a burglary of a house where he took 100,000 euros. And he was a very prolific burglar, so he was often taking. There's the mask, you see. Now that's the mask that they found, but also there are photographs we've seen for the first time where he put on Photoshop some masks onto him naked when he was standing by the Irade Lake, where of course the police searched, if you remember, 2 years ago in Portugal. And some of these photos where he's naked, and often he has an erect member, very odd photos that he took. I don't know, I think he took a lot of himself, but I don't know who took them. That's a fascinating idea to know who might have taken them, actually. But in these pictures, he's actually mapped up a black balaclava onto his face to show what he would look like if he was, say, attacking a victim. And of course, we know that he attacked various victims. He's in prison now for 7 years for the R of a very old, unfortunately now passed away pensioner, American pensioner, and he wore a mask like the one we just seen. And that mask also was the one he wore when Hazel Bean was raped as well. And she's convinced that she saw him. You heard in court, she said went to court bravely, gave her evidence. She's absolutely certain, and I believe